Beneath the pristine, freezing peaks of Yulong Snow Mountain, a mysterious woven sack concealed a wealthy traveler's sudden, chilling disappearance. How did a missing finger joint and a massive stolen fortune spark a desperate 19-year search for a phantom who vanished without a single trace? Please like and subscribe to join us on this case. This video contains chilling secrets. Viewer discretion is advised. Yunnan Province in China is renowned for its diverse, breathtaking landscapes. Towering above the ancient city of Lijiang is the majestic Yulong Snow Mountain, a sprawling expanse of jagged, snow-capped peaks that attracts countless tourists seeking its ethereal beauty. But beneath the pristine white surface of this popular destination, the harsh, unforgiving winter environment creates the perfect conditions to conceal a brutal and calculated crime. The morning of December 10th, 1990, began like any other for Mr. Ma. At over 60 years old, Ma was a sanitation worker whose daily routine involved trekking up the steep mountain trails to collect the trash left behind by tourists. Because the end of the year brought a massive influx of visitors to the mountain, Ma had to start his shift early, stepping out into the biting cold at 5 in the morning. As he made his way along a narrow, sloping path that bordered a shallow ravine, something unusual caught his attention. It was not a sight, but a smell. A faint, sickening odor of decay drifted upward on the freezing mountain breeze. It was subtle, mostly masked by the frigid air, but persistent enough to make his stomach turn. Driven by a mix of responsibility and morbid curiosity, Ma peered down into the ravine. The drop was nearly 10 feet deep, heavily shadowed, and lined with sharp rocks. At the bottom, partially obscured by broken tree branches, he spotted a large, unnatural, white shape. Ma carefully climbed down to investigate. As he cleared away the snapped branches, the white shape revealed itself to be a massive canvas sack. It was bound tightly with thick rope in 3 separate sections, specifically at the top, the middle, and the bottom. The rigid, elongated shape of the bundle was unmistakably human. Hoping it was just discarded camping equipment, or perhaps an illegally poached animal, Ma poked the sack with his iron trash-picking rod. There was no movement, only the dull thud of something solid inside. Desperate to resolve the sickening smell and his mounting dread, he forcefully drove the iron rod into the canvas and tore a massive gash down the side. The frozen, bloodless flesh of a human corpse spilled into view. Blind panic consumed the elderly man. He scrambled out of the ravine, slipping repeatedly on the icy rocks, and sprinted down the mountain path to the nearest rest station to alert the authorities. Local law enforcement arrived swiftly. They cordoned off the hiking trails and issued a strict lockdown, prohibiting anyone from entering or leaving the vicinity. But securing the crime scene was a monumental task. The Yulong Snow Mountain Range stretches for 22 miles in length and 12 miles in width, with its highest peak, Chengdu, soaring to over 18,300 feet. The sheer vastness and rugged terrain made a sweeping search nearly impossible. Retrieving the body presented a major logistical hurdle. The ravine, while only 10 feet deep, was completely inaccessible to heavy machinery due to the icy incline. During the rainy season, this crevice acted as a natural water reservoir, but in winter, it was a bone-dry trap. Officers had to rely entirely on brute human strength. They attached thick ropes to the sack and painstakingly hauled the heavy, rigid bundle up the slippery slope, fighting for traction on the frozen earth. Once the body was successfully brought to the surface, forensic investigators began the grim task of unwrapping the makeshift shroud. The killer, or killers, had gone to great lengths to secure the victim. The outermost layer consisted of 2 thick white canvas sacks pulled over the body from opposite ends and tied off in 3 segments to prevent any shifting during transport. Slicing through the canvas, investigators found a second layer of thick plastic wrapping, the exact kind typically used by vendors to protect valuable goods or large souvenirs. Packed tightly around the body beneath the plastic were handfuls of dried leaves, seemingly used to absorb bodily fluids or mask the scent of decomposition. The most striking detail, however, was found at the head of the victim. It was entirely encased in a heavily worn, woven fabric bag featuring a distinct, unfamiliar geometric pattern. Investigators carefully removed the woven bag to examine the victim. He was a male, estimated to be between 30 and 35 years old, standing roughly 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighing about 154 pounds. Despite the freezing temperatures, he was dressed in relatively thin clothing. He wore a black long-sleeve shirt with red stripes, cotton-lined trousers, and athletic sneakers. It was a glaring inconsistency. No one venturing onto the freezing slopes of Yulong Snow Mountain in December would dress so lightly, strongly suggesting he had been killed indoors or in a much warmer climate before being transported to the frozen peaks. The medical examiner's preliminary autopsy provided a harrowing picture of the man's final moments. The extreme cold had significantly slowed the decomposition process, allowing the coroner to determine that the victim had been dead for approximately 3 days. The primary cause of death was massive blunt force trauma to the skull, likely inflicted by a heavy, rounded object like a hammer. But the horrific violence did not stop there. The victim's body was covered in deep, hacking wounds. The depth and spread of these lacerations indicated the use of a heavy but relatively dull weapon, such as an unsharpened wood-chopping axe. The medical examiner also noted a single, fresh puncture wound on the torso, which was quickly matched to the iron rod Mr. Ma had used to tear open the sack. Searching for identifying marks, investigators found no tattoos or distinct birthmarks. However, they did make one crucial discovery. The pinky finger on the victim's left hand was missing its top joint. The smooth, fully healed skin over the stump indicated this was an old injury, long predating the murder. Despite the meticulous examination of the body, the crime scene itself offered nothing but dead ends. There were no footprints left in the snow near the crevice. There were no stray fibers, no dropped items, and absolutely no fingerprints on the canvas sacks or the plastic wrapping. This indicated that the perpetrators had worn heavy gloves and possessed a high degree of anti-surveillance awareness. Furthermore, there was not a single drop of blood found anywhere on the mountain trail or inside the ravine. The investigators concluded with absolute certainty that this was merely a secondary dumping ground. The actual murder, the brutal bludgeoning and hacking, had taken place somewhere else entirely. With no wallet, no identification papers, and no obvious murder weapon, the police were left with a completely anonymous victim. They had a frozen body, a distinctive woven bag, and a killer who knew exactly how to disappear into the vastness of the mountains. Identifying the anonymous victim became the task force's absolute priority. Captain Liu, a seasoned investigator with the Yunnan Provincial Police Department, spearheaded the exhaustive effort. Detailed notices describing the victim's clothing and the missing finger joint were broadcast across local radio stations and plastered over utility poles, transit stations, and community boards. Simultaneously, detectives combed through missing persons reports filed within the preceding 5 to 7 days, but no one matching the victim's description had been reported. A massive search grid was established, spanning a 3-mile radius around Yulong Snow Mountain. Local households were canvassed, but after 2 grueling days, the investigation hit a seemingly impenetrable wall. Captain Liu recognized that without a known motive or identity, they could not rule out the terrifying prospect of a highly organized serial killer operating in the tourist-heavy region. He ordered his team to re-examine every single piece of physical evidence recovered from the freezing ravine. The white canvas sacks provided the first crucial breakthrough. Detectives noted that while the 2 ends of the bundled sacks were relatively pristine, the middle section was heavily frayed, torn, and caked with thick, dark mud. If a single person had simply dragged the body or pushed it down the slope, the canvas would have sustained random, widespread damage. Instead, the concentrated scraping in the center suggested the heavy burden, weighing over 154 pounds, had sagged deeply toward the ground while suspended by its ends. This specific wear pattern proved conclusively that at least two perpetrators had hauled the body through the rugged mountain terrain together. The inner plastic wrapping offered another clue, though a frustratingly broad one. It was a common commercial material sold at nearly every local tourist shop to protect souvenirs. But the woven bag covering the victim's battered head was entirely different. The thick fabric bore the distinct traditional geometric patterns of the Naxi people, an ethnic group indigenous to the Himalayan foothills. Unlike mass-produced trinkets sold to tourists, this bag was heavily worn. Its carrying straps were completely frayed, and its vibrant colors had faded from years of daily use. Most importantly, at the bottom corner, investigators spotted a strange, custom-embroidered symbol. Armed with this evidence, detectives descended upon the local Naxi villages nestled along the mountain slopes. The Naxi villagers primarily made their living trading mountain livestock or meticulously weaving traditional textiles. When shown photographs of the bag, several locals immediately recognized the regional style, but could not pinpoint the exact owner. The search was stalling until an older woman recognized the precise stitching technique. She informed the police that this specific variation of the pattern was unique to the He family. Acting on this critical tip, investigators arrived at the He household, only to find the front door padlocked from the outside. Neighbors explained that the household consisted only of an elderly mother and her son, He Jiwen. Following the community's matriarchal tradition, the son had taken his mother's surname. They mentioned that the mother was likely foraging high in the mountains, while He Jiwen had been missing from the village for several days. Neighbors described the son as a highly secretive man who occasionally brought unidentified strangers to the house before disappearing again. His only known legitimate work was helping his mother transport her woven goods down to the local souvenir shops. As dusk fell, the elderly Mrs. He returned from the mountain trails. She was deeply startled to find law enforcement waiting at her doorstep. When presented with photographs of the woven bag, she immediately recognized her own handiwork. She explained that the symbol at the bottom was a customized signature indicating ownership. She had woven the bag herself as a personal gift for a man who frequently accompanied her son, a business associate named Dong Jiming, Mrs. He knew little about the man, other than that he occasionally stayed overnight and lived in Jiatou County within Lijiang City. When asked if Dong Jiming had any distinguishing physical features, the elderly woman recalled noticing something unusual while serving him dinner. The man was missing the top joint of his left pinky finger. The pieces finally locked together. Wasting no time, detectives drove straight to Jiatou County. A public records search revealed 3 men named Dong Jiming in the area, but only one matched the victim's age profile. Arriving at the upscale residence, officers were greeted by Dong's wife, Yu Lemay. She appeared visibly rattled, stammering defensively when the detectives asked about her husband's whereabouts. When they cautiously stated they had discovered a body on Yulong Snow Mountain, she insisted her husband was simply away on a routine business trip. However, when investigators laid out the photographs of the victim's specific clothing and the severed finger joint, her denial collapsed into sheer terror. To confirm the identity, police matched the victim's genetic material to Dong's young son. The laboratory results confirmed what the detectives already knew. The man in the frozen ravine was Dong Jiming. Born in 1962 to poor farmers, Dong relentlessly hustled his way into wealth as regional tourism boomed. He and his wife built an affluent but highly secretive life, rarely interacting with neighbors. According to Yu Limei, her husband left home before dawn on December 7, 1990, to secure a massive shipment of goods. He had been dead for roughly 3 days when discovered on December 10th. Yet, despite him being unreachable for almost a week, she had never filed a police report. Suspicious of her strange demeanor, investigators demanded to search the house. Yu Lemei's hands trembled violently as she led them through the meticulously clean home. At the back of the house, they reached a heavy wooden door secured with a massive iron padlock. When asked for the key, she claimed her husband had taken it with him. Detectives threatened to breach the door by force. Defeated and shaking, she finally produced the key from her pocket. As the heavy door swung open, the overwhelming, acrid stench of sulfur and chemicals flooded the hallway. The room was packed from floor to ceiling with wooden crates and thick canvas sacks. The detectives had not found a simple storage closet. They had just stumbled upon nearly 2,000 pounds of highly volatile, illegal commercial explosives. Terrified and sobbing, Eula May finally confessed the dark reality of her family's sudden wealth. Since the beginning of the year, her husband, Dong Jiming, had been secretly operating in a legal and highly lucrative side business, dealing in black market explosives. A rampant rumor had recently swept through the region, claiming that a massive, pure gold nugget had been unearthed deep within the local mountains. This sparked a desperate, localized gold rush. Hundreds of impoverished locals abandoned their regular jobs, flocking to the hills with dreams of overnight fortune. Recognizing a massive opportunity, Dong capitalized on this frenzy by sourcing commercial-grade dynamite and selling it to these amateur, unregulated prospectors at a steep markup. Eula May tearfully admitted that her husband had recently secured a major buyer, the very same He Jiwen, whose family name was stitched into the woven bag found at the crime scene. According to her, on the morning of December 7th, 1990, Dong left the house specifically to meet He Jiwen. The two men had arranged to cross the treacherous border into neighboring Myanmar to finalize a massive contraband purchase. Because the end of the year was the peak season for illicit mining operations, the demand for explosives was astronomically high. Urged on by He Jiwen to go all in on this final, massive shipment, Dong and his wife had liquidated all their assets and borrowed heavily from their extended family. They managed to scrape together nearly 40,000 yuan. In 1990, this was an absolute fortune in rural China, equivalent to roughly $8,000 American dollars at the time, and carrying the purchasing power of nearly $20,000 today. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place. He Jiwen was the last person seen with Dong Jiming. He was familiar with the mountain terrain. He had connections to the woven bag used to conceal the victim's head. Most damning of all, the massive fortune of 40,000 yuan was entirely missing. The investigation officially pivoted from a mysterious homicide to a brutal, calculated robbery and murder. Recognizing that every passing hour gave the killer more time to vanish, Captain Liu launched an unprecedented, massive manhunt. Over 100 armed officers were immediately dispatched to lock down the region. They erected heavy barricades across every major intersection, choked off the narrow alleyways of Lijiang, and plastered wanted posters featuring He Jiwen's face on every available surface. Knowing the suspect intimately understood the local geography, Captain Liu suspected He Jiwen might attempt to slip through the mountainous wilderness and cross the international border. Liaisons were urgently sent to coordinate with Border Patrol units to cut off any potential escape routes into neighboring countries. The scale of the operation swelled rapidly, ultimately drawing in over 300 police officers from across the province. While the city was being locked down, a specialized tactical team of 10 officers was ordered to trek directly into the brutal, freezing expanse of Yulong Snow Mountain to hunt down the fugitive. The conditions were nothing short of nightmarish. As the deep winter settled in, the blizzards intensified, burying the mountain trails under thick layers of ice and snow. The officers, lacking modern Arctic gear, were forced to improvise just to survive. They layered every piece of clothing they owned and desperately wrapped dry straw around their legs, torsos, and arms, attempting to insulate themselves against the biting, sub-zero winds that threatened to freeze their sweat to their skin. They survived on hardened dry rations and melted snow, sleeping in shallow caves or huddled behind massive boulders to escape the deadly wind chill. The physical and psychological toll was immense. Years later, officers recalled the haunting, relentless howl of the mountain wind and the agonizing, bone-deep cold that constantly pushed them to the brink of hypothermia and complete physical exhaustion. Despite their incredible resilience and determination to bring a killer to justice, the unforgiving climate eventually won. After 5 grueling days of navigating the lethal terrain without finding a single trace of He Jiwen, their rations were completely depleted, and several men were falling severely ill. The team had no choice but to admit defeat and slowly descend back to civilization, realizing they were dealing with a cunning adversary who possessed strong anti-surveillance skills and a lethal survival instinct. The provincial police department authorized a massive public bounty. They offered a staggering reward of 20,000 yuan, equivalent to about $4,000, for any information leading to an arrest. The enormous financial incentive worked almost immediately. An unlicensed taxi driver named Cheng came forward with a deeply unsettling encounter. He told investigators that on the frigid evening of December 7th, the exact day Dong Jiming vanished, he was driving down a desolate road near the exit of Yulong Snow Mountain when 2 men frantically flagged him down. The men were covered in thick mud, breathing heavily, and looked thoroughly exhausted. They demanded to be taken to the long-distance bus terminal. When they arrived at the station, the shorter of the 2 men reached into his coat and pulled out a massive, intimidating brick of cash to pay the fare. The driver noted a bizarre detail. Despite the freezing winter temperatures, one of the men was only wearing light summer sandals. The glaring contrast between their impoverished, disheveled appearance and the sheer volume of cash they carried burned the image into Chiang's memory. When detectives showed him the composite sketches, the driver did not hesitate. He pointed directly at the face of He Jiwen, positively identifying him as the shorter man carrying the massive wad of cash. Rushing to the bus terminal, investigators confirmed the driver's story. Late on the night of December 7th, He Jiwen had purchased 2 long-distance bus tickets. The destination was Guangdong Province, over 1,000 miles away on the southern coast of China. The killer had escaped the mountains, but the hunt was far from over. With the suspects known to be fleeing toward the southern coastal province of Guangdong, investigators from Yunnan urgently reached out to their regional counterparts to coordinate an aggressive interstate manhunt. But before they could catch the mastermind, they needed to identify the second man. A crucial piece of the puzzle came from He Jiwen's own mother. During subsequent questioning, the elderly woman recalled that her son frequently associated with a local ex-convict named Mao Zi. When investigators presented a suspect profile and photo array to the unlicensed taxi driver, he immediately and positively identified Mao Zi as the second, taller man who had fled the mountain that frigid evening. The investigative net began to tighten rapidly when a local grocery store owner came forward with another chilling piece of the timeline. She recounted that several days prior, a highly agitated man had rushed into her shop to purchase an unusually large quantity of thick plastic wrapping and heavy canvas sacks. Because the customer was buying such large amounts in a sheer panic, the interaction had left a lasting impression on her. While she could not initially recall if the purchase happened exactly on December 7th, one glance at the freshly printed wanted poster was all she needed. She immediately identified the frantic customer as Mao Zi. Armed with solid identification and the full force of a multi-province task force, the relentless pursuit finally yielded a major breakthrough. On December 27th, heavily armed officers raided a seedy motel in Guangdong and dragged a terrified Mao Zi into custody. Once securely confined in an interrogation room, the hardened ex-convict completely broke down. Realizing the sheer weight of the evidence against him, Mao Zi waived his rights and offered a full, horrifyingly detailed confession of the murder. He admitted that upon successfully reaching Guangdong, He Jiwen handed him a stack of 5,000 yuan, equivalent to roughly 1,000 American dollars at the time, and abruptly severed ties. The 2 men immediately parted ways to avoid drawing attention. and Mao Zi claimed he had not seen or heard from He Zhen since that day. Delving into their background, Mao Zi explained that he and He Zhen were criminal business partners. They primarily operated as underground smugglers, guiding desperate clients across the treacherous mountain borders to evade immigration patrols. Because Mao Zi had a severe criminal record and lacked formal education, no legitimate employer would hire him, forcing him into the dangerous world of border smuggling to survive. However, the money earned from smuggling paled in comparison to their voracious personal spending. Both Mao Zi and He Zhen were severely addicted to high-stakes underground gambling. The vice completely consumed them, but He Zhen found himself drowning in a terrifying predicament. He had racked up a staggering gambling debt of nearly 30,000 yuan, which carried the purchasing power of about 6,000 American dollars at the time. With ruthless local loan sharks threatening his life on a daily basis, He Zhen was occasionally forced to flee the village to survive. Driven by desperation, he engineered a cold-blooded plot to rob and murder his wealthiest client. He confessed to Mao Zi that even if he worked for the rest of his life and sold his mother's house, he could never satisfy the violent debt collectors. His only way out was to execute one massive heist, pay off the syndicate, and start a new life. He promised Mao Zi a flat fee of 5,000 yuan for his physical help. Blinded by greed, Mao Zi agreed. The horrifying timeline of December 7th, 1990, finally came into sharp focus. In the early hours before dawn, the two men welcomed Dong Jiming into the He family home under the guise of finalizing their illicit explosives deal. Upon arriving, He Zhen casually asked if Dong had brought the capital for the border purchase. Dong enthusiastically unzipped the custom-woven bag, revealing a massive stack of 40,000 yuan, and boasted that he would tip them handsomely once the smuggling run was complete. With the money confirmed, the trap was sprung. While the three men sat eating and drinking, He Zhen excused himself to use the restroom. He silently retrieved a heavy steel hammer, crept up directly behind the unsuspecting victim, and delivered a devastating, full-force blow to the back of Dong's skull. Dong collapsed instantly, unconscious, and bleeding on the dirt floor. To ensure their victim was completely dead, both He Zhen and Mao Zi grabbed heavy, dull wood-chopping axes and relentlessly hacked at the helpless man. Once the slaughter was complete, Mao Zi was dispatched to the local grocery store to purchase the plastic wrapping and canvas sacks, while He Zhen began the cleanup. Moving with chilling efficiency, He Zhen gathered aromatic medicinal herbs his mother had harvested and packed them tightly inside the plastic wrapping with the body. He told Mao Zi the herbs would act as an embalming agent to mask the smell of rotting flesh. After scrubbing the blood from the floor, they shoved the murder weapons under a heavy wooden bed. Because He Zhen's mother left before sunrise every day to forage, she was entirely oblivious to the evil that had just occurred in her living room. The two killers then hauled the bundled corpse out the back door and began the grueling trek up the mountain trails. After dumping the body into the shallow ravine and burying it under broken branches, the murderers fled down the mountain, hailed the taxi, and vanished. Following the confession, forensic teams descended upon the He family home once more. Pulling apart the floorboards and dismantling the bed, they uncovered tiny splatters of dried blood, soaked into the baseboards, alongside the dull, blood-stained axe. The physical evidence perfectly corroborated the confession, shattering the heart of the elderly mother, who finally realized her son was a monster. When investigators formally delivered the devastating news to He Zhen's elderly mother regarding her son's unspeakable crimes, the frail woman entirely collapsed under the crushing weight of the revelation. For her, the horrific reality was impossible to reconcile with the quiet, helpful boy she had raised. Born into the Naxi ethnic minority, He Zhen's childhood had been defined by grueling poverty, harsh winters, and bitter hardship. His father had passed away when he was merely an infant, leaving his mother to shoulder the immense burden of their survival entirely alone in a merciless landscape. Day and night, regardless of the freezing temperatures or pouring rain. She hiked the treacherous mountain trails to forage for medicinal herbs. She spent her late evenings tirelessly weaving the traditional, brightly colored bags that would eventually become the crucial evidence in a massive murder investigation. Growing up, He Jiwen had witnessed his mother's relentless sacrifices firsthand. For a time, he mirrored her tremendous work ethic, deeply determined to lift them out of their impoverished state through honest labor. His downfall, however, began quietly during his routine. Daily deliveries of his mother's woven goods to the bustling, wealthy tourist shops down in the valley. It was there that he was first exposed to the intoxicating, high-stakes world of underground gambling, watching local street hustlers and wealthy tourists carelessly throw around thick stacks of cash that could easily feed his struggling family for an entire year. A dangerous, consuming seed of envy took root. He began placing small, cautious bets, desperately hoping for a miraculous payout that would instantly change his life and rescue his mother from her endless toil. But the promised wealth never materialized. Instead, the insidious addiction tightened its grip, dragging him into a vicious, inescapable financial spiral. His debts ballooned far beyond his ability to pay through any legitimate means, forcing him to leverage his intimate, lifelong knowledge of the rugged mountain terrain. He began running a shadow business, leading and smuggling desperate individuals across the heavily guarded international border for cash. It was a highly perilous life, operating completely outside the law, culminating ultimately in the brutal slaughter of his wealthiest, most trusting client, with Mao Zi, the brutal accomplice, facing the immediate justice of a firing squad for his active role in the grisly execution. Capturing the elusive mastermind became the absolute priority for the provincial police. However, despite virtually locking down the entire southern province of Guangdong, He Jiwen completely vanished into the shadows. It was as if he had simply evaporated into the dense, humid coastal air of southern China, leaving no clear trail, no frantic whispers, and no physical trace behind. Believing the desperate fugitive might seek immediate refuge with distant family members, heavily armed tactical units raided several documented addresses in the sprawling, neon-lit metropolis of Shenzhen, but every single lead ultimately evaporated into a frustrating, empty, dead end. Determined not to let the monstrous killer slip away forever, investigators established a permanent, highly covert surveillance perimeter around the He family home back in Yunnan. Undercover officers continuously monitored the rural residents 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, operating under the strong psychological assumption that the fugitive's deep, emotional bond with his aging mother would eventually compel him to return home. But He Jiwen never came back. The grueling mountain murder fractured into a chilling, deeply frustrating cold case. Seasons changed, and decades drifted by. The leadership hierarchy within the Yunnan Provincial Police Department changed hands multiple times, with fresh, new captains, repeatedly inheriting the heavy, lingering burden of the unsolved tragedy. Yet, the brutal bludgeoning on Yulong Snow Mountain was never truly forgotten. It remained a mandatory, highly detailed briefing in every major departmental strategy meeting, serving as a haunting, terrifying reminder of the brilliant ghost who had somehow outsmarted a massive 300-man manhunt. While the physical trail had frozen solid over the years, the world around the fugitive was rapidly changing. By the year 2019, 19 years after the horrific slaughter in the snowy mountains, law enforcement technology had undergone a massive structural revolution. The grainy, hand-drawn composite sketches of the past had been fully digitized and enhanced by facial recognition software, while robust national biometric databases seamlessly connected isolated provincial precincts across the entire country. Still, despite the vast, inescapable technological web, the elusive killer remained completely off the national grid, quietly operating in the darkest margins of society. The sudden breakthrough when it finally arrived after nearly 2 decades of deafening silence, did not stem from a brilliant piece of deductive detective work or a highly coordinated tactical strike by elite forces. It came from an entirely mundane, alcohol-fueled public disturbance on a quiet Wednesday evening. On May 22, 2019, a standard municipal patrol unit received an urgent, frantic dispatch regarding a violent, physical altercation at a local neighborhood tavern. According to the panicked tavern owner's emergency call, 2 heavily intoxicated men were aggressively tearing apart the establishment, smashing glass bottles, destroying heavy wooden furniture, and viciously assaulting each other in the main dining area. Fearing the chaotic, bloody brawl would escalate into a fatal stabbing, the owner pleaded for immediate, forceful police intervention. Officers arrived swiftly on the scene, physically subduing the 2 highly belligerent, bloodied drunks and dragging them into the back of a waiting squad car. Both men were so completely inebriated they could barely stand on their own 2 feet. Back at the heavily lit precinct, the standard booking process began. The first man, slurring his words heavily, confidently identified himself as Li Fa, a 45-year-old local vendor who sold electrical light bulbs at the municipal outdoor market. The second man, heavily battered and reeking strongly of cheap alcohol, was completely incoherent, entirely incapable of even stammering out his own basic name. Searching the silent, bruised, and bleeding man for any form of identification, officers discovered a severely weathered, cracked identification card bearing the fake name Zhu Gong. However, when the desk sergeant manually entered the specific identification number into the National Registry, the computer system kicked back a glaring red error message. The physical description and residential history linked to the name Zhu Gong did not align whatsoever with the ragged man slumped defeatedly in the holding cell. Sensing something deeply suspicious and inherently wrong about the fabricated identity, the precinct captain immediately ordered the booking officers to physically roll the suspect's fingerprints and run them through the modernized National Biometric Database. The digital system scanned the whorls and ridges, rapidly comparing them against millions of securely stored criminal records. Within moments, the sterile computer screen flashed red with a definitive, absolutely undeniable biometric match. The ragged, drunken, and entirely defeated brawler sitting quietly in the local holding cell was definitely not an innocent man named Zhu Gong. He was Jiwen, the ruthless, calculating mastermind behind the horrific 19-year-old Yulong Snow Mountain butchery. The sheer irony of the situation was completely staggering. A cold-blooded, meticulous killer who had successfully evaded an entire army of 300 dedicated officers, survived nearly 2 long decades living as an invisible ghost, and completely erased his own violent history, was ultimately undone by a foolish, careless, and drunken bar fight. His desperate, lifelong attempt to drown his crushing paranoia in alcohol had finally secured his ultimate doom. The realization that the disheveled, heavily intoxicated man sitting in the holding cell was one of the most notoriously elusive fugitives in the history of the province sent an absolute shockwave through the local police department. The digital biometric match was undeniable. After 19 years of operating as an invisible ghost, He Jiwen had finally been captured. He was immediately placed in maximum security confinement, his drunken belligerence rapidly evaporating into a hollow, defeated silence as the true gravity of his situation settled over him. Heavily armed tactical units swiftly arranged for his immediate extradition, transporting the captured murderer over 1,000 miles back to the mountainous terrain of Yunnan province, the very place where his horrific crimes had originally been committed nearly 2 decades prior. The reopening of the Yulong Snow Mountain murder case was a monumental, deeply emotional victory for the provincial police department. For countless investigators, both active and retired, the frozen corpse found wrapped in canvas had been a lingering, agonizing failure that haunted their entire careers. Now, the massive mountain of physical evidence, meticulously preserved since the bitter winter of 1990, was finally brought into the searing light of a courtroom. When He Jiwen was formally led into the judicial chamber to face his deeply awaited reckoning, he stood entirely alone. His former criminal associate and brutal accomplice, Mao Zedong, had already faced a swift and final judgment, having been executed by a firing squad many years prior for his active role in the grisly slaughter. Faced with overwhelming, irrefutable forensic evidence, including the bloody axe, the matching fingerprints, and the deeply detailed, corroborated confession of his deceased accomplice, He Jiwen made no attempt to deny his monstrous actions. Instead, as he stood before the solemn panel of judges, he offered a harrowing, deeply unsettling glimpse into the psychological torment of a hunted man. He quietly confessed to the hushed courtroom that throughout his entire 19 years living on the run, he had never experienced a single, comfortable night of undisturbed sleep. Every unexpected knock at the door, every passing police siren, and every lingering glance from a stranger in the street had sent sheer, freezing terror directly through his veins. His voice broke as he spoke extensively about his profound, agonizing guilt regarding his elderly mother. He knew intimately that she was still living in deep poverty, forced by his selfish, brutal actions to continue toiling away day and night on the freezing, unforgiving slopes of the towering mountains just to survive her twilight years. He had abandoned her to a life of complete misery and profound shame. However, his tears of remorse were heavily laced with a grim, twisted justification for the horrific violence he had orchestrated. He bluntly, coldly admitted to the court that if he had not ruthlessly murdered Dong Jiming and stolen the massive sum of cash, his own life would have been forfeit. The vicious underground gambling syndicates to whom he owed his staggering, insurmountable debts would have undoubtedly hunted him down, tortured him, and killed him without a second thought. In his deeply corrupted mind, the brutal execution in the dirt-floored living room was a necessary, calculated act of sheer survival. But the most absolute, devastating shock of the entire trial did not come from his horrific confessions of the past, but rather the astonishing revelation of his double life. During his 19 long years as a desperate fugitive, successfully hiding behind the completely fabricated identity of a quiet electrical goods vendor, He Jiwen had managed to build an entirely new life. He had courted a woman, married her, and fathered children, all while keeping his dark, blood-soaked history completely hidden. As the trial neared its absolute conclusion, he turned away from the judges and looked directly into the crowded public gallery to issue a tearful, desperate apology to his new wife and children for deeply deceiving them for nearly 2 decades. The sheer, traumatic impact of this revelation was catastrophic. His wife, completely shattered by the horrifying, incomprehensible realization that the gentle man she had slept beside every single night was actually a ruthless, calculating murderer, screamed in sheer terror and collapsed completely to the courtroom floor in a dead faint. The judicial panel showed absolutely no mercy. The horrific, premeditated nature of the robbery, the extreme, hacking brutality of the murder, and the agonizing 19 years of evasion demanded the ultimate, final penalty. The presiding judge swiftly and firmly sentenced He Jiwen to death. The ultimate sentence was carried out almost immediately following the final verdict, permanently closing the book on his violent, deceptive existence and officially ending a nearly 2-decade-long manhunt. The final resolution of this deeply harrowing, exhausting saga marked the absolute end of one of the largest and most intensive investigations in the recorded history of the regional law enforcement agencies. The staggering operation had ultimately required the relentless dedication of over 300 heavily armed officers braving lethal blizzards, alongside the sheer, stubborn persistence of generations of brilliant detectives who absolutely refused to let the case freeze over. While the 2 perpetrators had finally, rightfully paid for their exceptionally heinous crimes with their own lives, The deep, agonizing wounds inflicted upon the surviving families would never truly heal. Dong Jieming's grieving widow and deeply traumatized son were forced to navigate decades of profound sorrow and financial hardship. On the absolute other side of the devastating tragedy, Ji Wen's elderly mother, was left entirely alone in the mountains, her weary heart permanently shattered by the monstrous, unforgivable actions of the only son she had sacrificed everything to raise. The harrowing case of Yulong Snow Mountain proves that no matter how deep the snow or how much time passes, the relentless pursuit of justice never truly freezes over. But the devastating collateral damage left behind for both families remains a heavy, lingering tragedy. What are your thoughts on this deeply unsettling case? Do you believe the 19 years of extreme paranoia and sleepless nights were a form of psychological torture worse than his ultimate sentence? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like and subscribe for more true crime investigations.